Number 1. Miguel Antonio de Jesus. Miguel Antonio de Jesus walked out of the broken window of a Pasadena, Texas home, carrying a bag filled with jewelry, cash, and electronics he had just taken with his partner, Diego Ortiz. It was early afternoon on November 14th, 2007, broad daylight, in a quiet subdivision near the 6700 block of Timberline Drive. The home they targeted belonged to Joe Horn's next-door neighbor, who was not there at the time. Both men moved quickly, stepping across the property line with the stolen items and preparing to flee. They had not spoken to the homeowner inside the neighboring house, and there was no indication they expected confrontation outside. But what they did not see from the driveway was that 61-year-old Joe Horn was standing behind his own front door with a 12-gauge shotgun in his hands. After spending several minutes on the phone with a 911 dispatcher describing every movement they made, Horn had watched the break-in unfold from his home. He saw the men force entry and move through the neighbor's property, and he called 911 to report it. The dispatcher repeatedly instructed him not to go outside. The warnings were direct. He was told officers were already on their way, told that confronting the burglars could get him killed, told that property was not worth risking his life over. Horn disagreed. Throughout the call, he referenced a new law he believed allowed him to intervene. On the recording, he stated more than once that he would not let the men get away. Each time the dispatcher urged him to remain inside, Horn responded with growing resolve. As the burglary progressed, a plainclothes Pasadena police detective arrived in the area and parked nearby in an unmarked vehicle. He observed the scene but did not immediately make contact or reveal his presence. Meanwhile, the 911 call continued. Horn watched as the two men exited the neighbor's home carrying a bag of stolen property. He told the dispatcher they were moving away and that he was going out. The dispatcher said, "Don't go out there," Horn replied. "I'm not going to let them go." Those were among the final words spoken before the sound of a door opening came across the call. Seconds later, Horn stepped out onto his front yard with the shotgun. On the recording, he can be heard issuing a brief verbal command. What he shouted varies across accounts because the audio contains overlapping noise, but it was followed almost immediately by 3 blasts from the shotgun. The gunfire lasted only moments. Both suspects fell in or near Horn's yard. They died at the scene. The plainclothes officer later reported that at least one man appeared to be struck from the rear while moving away, a detail that triggered significant scrutiny. Pasadena police officials later said that due to the nature of shotgun pellet spread and tissue damage, the medical examiner could not conclusively determine entry angle based on the wounds. When officers and EMS arrived, the two men were already deceased. A bag containing the stolen jewelry, cash, and equipment was recovered nearby. Neither suspect was found with a firearm. They carried burglary tools and the stolen property, but no weapons beyond what was used to break into the home. Investigators identified the suspects as Miguel Antonio de Jesus, age 38, and Diego Ortiz, age 30. De Jesus was later confirmed to be Hernando Riascos Torres, a Colombian national living in the United States under an alias. Both men were in the country without legal status. From law enforcement, indicated that Torres had a prior conviction for cocaine trafficking and had been deported in 1999 before returning illegally. Horn was questioned by Pasadena police but was not arrested. The shooting triggered an immediate and polarized public reaction once the 911 recording became public. Protesters gathered in front of Horn's home in the days that followed. Some called the shooting an act of vigilante violence and raised concerns about race, since both suspects were Hispanic and unarmed. Others gathered to support Horn, arguing that he protected the neighborhood and acted lawfully in confronting felony suspects fleeing with stolen property. The incident became a focal point in national debates over citizen intervention, immigration enforcement, and Texas's expanded castle doctrine, which had been revised earlier that same year. Texas law allows the use of deadly force in certain circumstances to protect property, including at nighttime or when a suspect is fleeing with stolen items, and police cannot reasonably intercept them. Legal scholars emphasized that Horn's situation occurred in daylight and on a neighbor's property, making the application of the statute complex. Still, under the Texas Penal Code, deadly force can be justified to prevent the imminent escape of someone who has just committed burglary if the property cannot be safeguarded by other means. That legal question became central to the case. The investigation lasted several months. Pasadena police forwarded reports to the Harris County District Attorney's Office. A Harris County grand jury was convened to review the evidence, including the 911 recording, the ballistics findings, the plainclothes officer's observations, and the Texas statutory provisions Horn referenced. On June 30th, 2008, District Attorney Ken Magidson announced that the grand jury had declined to indict Horn on any criminal charge. He stated that although use of deadly force is limited by state law, the grand jury determined that Horn's actions did not rise to a criminal offense. With the no-bill decision, the case effectively closed. No charges were filed against Horn. The deaths of Torres and Ortiz were ruled justifiable under Texas law, based on the grand jury's application of the property defense statutes and their conclusions about Horn's perception of the situation as the burglary unfolded. The ruling remained controversial, becoming one of the most debated applications of the Castle Doctrine in Texas and cited repeatedly in discussions about armed intervention by private citizens. The sequence of events, from the burglary to the 911 call to the confrontation, was supported by police reports, the recovered stolen property, and the statements provided during the criminal inquiry. The exact angles of the shots and the movement of the suspects in the final seconds remain points where reports differ, but no evidence emerged that contradicted the central facts. Two men burglarized a neighbor's home, walked into Horn's yard with stolen property, and were shot as they attempted to flee. The grand jury concluded the law allowed Horn to intervene. The case left a lasting imprint on Texas legal and political discussions, not because the facts were unclear, but because the boundaries of justified deadly force were tested in real time, recorded in a 911 call, and debated nationwide afterward. For investigators and prosecutors, the legal question was ultimately answered by the grand jury. For the public, the debate continued long after the case was closed. Number 2. Nicholas Brady and Hailey Kiefer. It was Thanksgiving Day, November 22nd, 2012, when 17-year-old Nicholas Brady broke a window on the north side of Byron Smith's home in Little Falls, Minnesota, and stepped inside. He was not alone. His cousin, 18-year-old Hailey Kiefer, waited nearby, preparing to follow him. Neither teenager could see what was happening in the basement below them. 64-year-old Smith was already there, sitting in a chair at the bottom of the staircase with a loaded Mini-14 rifle in his hands. For weeks, he had been spending long hours in that basement, convinced that another break-in was coming. He had told people he felt targeted. He believed burglars had stolen his father's prisoner of war watch, cash, and tools in previous months. By November, he had removed light bulbs around the home, carried a handgun even while inside, and positioned a digital recorder on a bookshelf to capture anything that might happen next. According to that recording, the break-in began just after midday. Glass shattered upstairs. Footsteps moved across the main floor. Smith did not call 911. He stayed in his chair, rifle aimed at the narrow stairwell. When the first intruder began to descend, only the lower half of his body was visible. The audio captured one shot, then another. Brady fell onto the concrete floor. Smith walked toward him and fired a third round at close range. The teenager no longer moved. Smith dragged the body onto a tarp and pulled it into a workshop area at the back of the basement. Roughly 10 to 15 minutes passed before the second intruder entered. Kiefer came down the same staircase, unaware that Brady was already dead. Smith fired as she reached the lower steps, causing her to fall. The audio preserved her reaction and Smith's movements. After several seconds, he shot her again. She continued making noise, and Smith fired another close-range round. When she still appeared to be alive, the recording captured a final shot delivered under her chin. Prosecutors later called it a finishing shot. Autopsy results showed she was hit multiple times, including at least one shot fired at extremely close distance while she was already incapacitated. Smith did not contact authorities after the killings. He left both bodies in the basement overnight. The next day, he approached a neighbor, asking for help locating an attorney. That neighbor grew concerned and called the Morrison County Sheriff's Office. When deputies arrived, Smith calmly informed them there were two deceased individuals in his basement and led them inside. Investigators found the bodies on separate tarps, spent casings on the floor, and the recorder still running, capturing hours of audio after the shootings. When questioned, Smith told detectives he had feared for his life and believed the teenagers might have been armed. Neither was found with a weapon. Investigators determined both were unarmed and that Smith had fired after any immediate threat had ended. The recording, which contained Smith's remarks before, during, and after the shootings, became central evidence. Prosecutors argued that he had positioned himself in advance, lying in wait with loaded weapons, a chair, and a recorder. They stated that his actions were not split-second defensive reactions, but deliberate choices made when the intruders were already wounded or incapacitated. In April 2014, after a trial lasting several days, a jury deliberated for only a few hours before delivering its verdict. Smith was convicted of 2 counts of first-degree premeditated murder and 2 counts of second-degree murder. The judge imposed life sentences without the possibility of parole, the mandatory punishment under Minnesota law for first-degree murder. Smith's defense team argued on appeal that he acted within his right to defend his home under the state's Castle Doctrine, but the Minnesota Supreme Court later upheld the conviction. Justices concluded that the doctrine did not apply once the threat had ended, and that the audio recordings clearly established intentional, unjustified killings. The Little Falls case gained national attention because it challenged assumptions about home defense, the limits of reasonable force, and the line between protection and execution. It was not the initial shots that shaped the legal conclusion, but everything that followed. Prosecutors presented evidence showing Smith waited in a prearranged position, shot an unarmed teenager multiple times after he had fallen, reloaded, waited for the second intruder, shot her, and then delivered a final close-range round after she lay wounded on the basement floor. Those facts, supported by the recording and physical evidence, led jurors to conclude this was not self-defense. It was homicide carried out in a controlled, methodical manner. Byron Smith remains incarcerated at Minnesota Correctional Facility, Oak Park Heights, serving life without parole. The case continues to be cited in legal discussions about the boundaries of defensive force, often described as an example of how a lawful response to a burglary can become criminal once an intruder is subdued and the danger has passed. The evidence in this case, especially the audio recording, left little room for interpretation. 2 teenagers entered a home to commit a burglary. Smith responded with deadly force. But the shots delivered after the threat was over defined the crime, shaped the verdict, and determined that this Thanksgiving Day home invasion would end not as a self-defense incident, but as a double murder. Number 3. Derek Condon. Derek Ephraim Condon arrived at the rural edge of Bingham County just before sunrise, long before anyone inside the isolated home on West 600 North even stirred. He was 39 years old, a Blackfoot resident with no known criminal convictions, but a history that relatives described as unstable. Investigators later learned he had interacted with the homeowner years earlier at the pawn shop and gun range she once operated, a connection that prosecutors believe shaped why he targeted her. In the early hours of mid-March 2024, Condon parked his white Honda CR-V roughly 1 mile from the property, choosing a remote lava rock area where a vehicle would be unlikely to draw attention. From there, he crossed the open fields on foot, carrying a 9mm pistol, a .22 caliber handgun with a suppressor, duct tape, 2 pairs of handcuffs, rope, and a black ski mask. Everything about the approach suggested planning, not impulse. Shortly after 2 o'clock in the morning, he forced his way into the home, breaking a rear door window with a screwdriver found later at the scene. Inside, 85-year-old Christine Janayan was asleep in her bedroom, unaware that the intruder had already entered the hallway. When she opened her eyes, Condon was standing over her, flashlight and firearm pointed directly at her face. Evidence collected afterward indicated he struck her in the head at least once while she was still in bed. Blood was found on her pillow and the floor beside it. He ordered her out of the bedroom and guided her at gunpoint into the living room, where he handcuffed her wrists to a wooden chair. The threats began immediately. He wanted valuables, and he wanted them now. Christine told him she had very little, but Condon pressed the barrel of his gun against her head. She eventually revealed there were 2 safes downstairs. As he moved through the basement searching rooms, she remained handcuffed and wounded, listening to him go back and forth. During one of his trips upstairs, he encountered her adult disabled son in a downstairs room. According to the prosecutor's report, this discovery enraged him and escalated his threats. He accused her of hiding information, returned to the living room, and warned her more than once that she was going to die. When he went downstairs again, Christine pulled the chair toward her bedroom inch by inch, dragging its legs across the carpet. Inside her room, beneath her pillow, she kept a loaded .357 Magnum revolver. Still handcuffed, she managed to retrieve it, then dragged the chair back into the living room and concealed the weapon between the armrest and cushion of a nearby couch. Investigators later noted her firearm experience. She had once trained competitors for a shooting team and believed that familiarity played a critical role in what followed. Condon returned upstairs, continued rummaging, and renewed his threats. Christine later told investigators that in that moment, she believed she was about to be killed. She waited for an opening, reached for the revolver, and fired 2 rounds. Both shots struck Condon in the chest area. In response, he raised his 9mm handgun and emptied the magazine. Bullets tore through the living room, striking Christine in the abdomen, leg, arm, and chest. Mortally wounded, Condon staggered into the kitchen, where he collapsed and died. Christine fell to the floor, still handcuffed to the chair. The blood loss, shock, and injuries left her unable to move. Hours passed. Her disabled son remained downstairs, unaware of the exact situation. Christine lay on the living room floor for roughly 10 hours until late morning, when her son managed to bring her a phone. Shortly after midday, she called 911 and reported that she was handcuffed and the intruder was dead. Deputies arrived at approximately 12:17 p.m. and found the scene exactly as she described. Condon deceased in the kitchen, Christine severely injured but alive on the living room floor, the broken rear window visible, and firearms, ammunition, duct tape, and restraints scattered throughout the house. Tire tracks and footprints were documented, leading back toward the remote parking area where the Honda CR-V was located. Inside the vehicle, investigators found cash, a money clip, ammunition, and items consistent with robbery preparation. A 47-page deputy report detailed every piece of physical evidence recovered. Christine was airlifted to Eastern Idaho Regional Medical Center, where she underwent emergency treatment. During interviews with investigators, she described the sequence of events, though she acknowledged gaps in her memory due to the head injury and the shooting itself. Prosecutors compared her account with the physical evidence, scene photographs, and recovered items. Nothing contradicted her statements. Everything aligned with forced entry, armed burglary, kidnapping, aggravated battery, and credible threats to kill her. Bingham County Prosecutor Ryan Jolly initiated a formal incident review. After evaluating the detailed reports, ballistic evidence, the trajectory of rounds fired, and the timeline reconstructed from footprints and her son's morning movements, he issued a public conclusion. Christine's use of deadly force was justified under Idaho law. Condon's actions, armed entry, restraint, threats, and escalating violence created a clear and immediate danger of death or serious injury. Jolly stated that if Condon had survived, he would have faced felony charges, including attempted murder, kidnapping, burglary, robbery, and aggravated battery. Instead, the case was ruled a justifiable homicide. The prosecutor described Christine's actions as one of the most heroic acts of self-preservation he had ever reviewed. News of the incident spread throughout Idaho and across national outlets, largely because of the stark contrast between the victim's age and the demands of the situation she faced. It also underscored broader issues about rural isolation, targeted crime, and how quickly a planned home invasion can escalate into attempted murder. Although Condon had no documented criminal convictions in local records, relatives and acquaintances told investigators he had been struggling mentally in the period before the incident. That context, combined with his equipment, approach, and the methodical nature of the entry, painted a picture of premeditation rather than opportunism. His connection to Christine through her former pawn shop and gun range suggested he may have believed she kept valuables at home. In the aftermath, deputies secured the scene for several days, completing a forensic sweep of bullet trajectories, fingerprints, and blood patterns. The evidence consistently supported Christine's account and explained the sequence step by step. From the forced entry, to the movement of the chair, to the location of shell casings, every major detail matched the physical environment. No contradictory evidence emerged. The case was formally closed as justified, leaving investigators, prosecutors, and the community with a rare outcome: a violent home invasion stopped only because an 85-year-old woman fought back under extreme, life-threatening pressure. Christine survived her injuries. Condon did not. The timeline, the physical evidence, and the verified facts leave little ambiguity about what happened in that house. A targeted burglary became an attempted killing. An elderly homeowner, restrained and wounded, made a single decision that ended the threat. And a case that could have become another unsolved rural homicide instead became a clear example of lawful self-defense, documented in full by investigators and confirmed through forensic review. Number 4. Maxwell Cook. Maxwell Cook stepped onto the Peters property just after midday on a Monday in late March 2017. He was a teenager dressed in black, masked, gloved, and armed, moving with two friends he had known for years, Jacob Redfern and Jacob Woodruff. The three of them had already been on the property earlier that morning, burglarizing a detached garage and stealing liquor and speakers from a recreational room near the house. By the time they returned, their plan had escalated. They were not wandering. They were not lost. They were there for the main home, convinced it held more valuable items. A getaway driver, 21-year-old Elizabeth Rodriguez, waited nearby, coordinating the break-in and instructing them where to go. It was approximately 12:30 p.m. when the group shattered the glass of the back door and stepped inside the residence. The break-in was forceful and deliberate. Investigators later documented the door fragments and emphasized that all three teens were wearing clothing designed to conceal their identities. At least two brought weapons. One carried brass knuckles, another a knife. Their approach showed preparation for resistance and a willingness to confront anyone who interrupted them. They moved quickly through the entryway and into the kitchen, unaware that the home's resident, 23-year-old Zachary Peters, had already heard the sound of breaking glass. Peters was inside the house with his father. When he heard the noise, he armed himself with an AR-15 style rifle kept in the residence. In statements later released, deputies explained that the teens had already crossed through several interior rooms when Peters confronted them. The meeting between the armed homeowner and the masked intruders lasted only moments. There was no recorded dialogue, no negotiation, no prolonged standoff. It was an immediate collision between a resident defending his home and three individuals who had broken into it with masks, weapons, and a plan to steal. Multiple shots were fired. Two of the teens were hit inside the kitchen area. The third ran, made it out the door, collapsed in the driveway, and died near the entry to the property. When the shooting stopped, Peters retreated to his bedroom and dialed 911. The recording released later captured his voice as steady but shaken. He told the dispatcher that three people had broken into the house and that he had shot two inside. When asked what weapon he used, he replied plainly, an AR-15. Deputies arrived shortly after the call. Paramedics confirmed all three intruders were deceased. Neither Peters nor his father had any physical injuries. While investigators processed the scene, another development unfolded. Only hours after the shooting, Elizabeth Rodriguez walked into the Broken Arrow Police Department and said she had information about the incident. During questioning, she admitted to planning the burglary, driving the teens to the home, and waiting nearby while they carried out the break-in. Detectives concluded that she had prior indirect knowledge of the Peters residence and believed there were expensive items inside. That detail explained the earlier burglary of the garage and the decision to return for the main home. Prosecutors later emphasized that this was not a spontaneous act. It was coordinated, communicated, and executed with the intention of stealing property. Rodriguez was arrested on multiple charges, including 3 counts of first-degree or felony murder and several counts of burglary. Under Oklahoma's felony murder rule, anyone who participates in a dangerous felony that results in death can be charged with murder, even if they never enter the home or fire a weapon. As the driver and planner, she fell under that statute. She was held without bond and ultimately faced prosecution for her role in setting the events in motion. Later regional reports documented that she pled guilty to reduced charges of second-degree murder and burglary and received a 32-year sentence. Parallel to her prosecution, the Wagoner County District Attorney's Office reviewed Peters' actions. Assistant District Attorney Jack Thorpe analyzed statements, photographs, physical evidence from the home, the 911 call, and the forced entry damage. On April 3, 2017, he publicly announced that Peters would not face charges. Thorpe stated that Peters acted justifiably, and was fully within the limits of Oklahoma law when he used deadly force inside the home. The legal foundation was the state's castle doctrine, which allows homeowners to defend themselves with lethal force when an intruder unlawfully enters the residence and poses a threat. In this case, the intruders were masked, armed, and had broken through a locked door. Those facts made the analysis straightforward in the eyes of prosecutors. Family members of the deceased teens later questioned the necessity of lethal force, arguing that the boys had made a terrible choice but should not have died for it. Law enforcement officials responded with equal clarity, stating that the teens entered a private residence, dressed and equipped for a high-risk burglary, and that homeowners are not expected to differentiate motives during a violent, forced entry. Deputies also pointed out that the group had already burglarized another structure on the property earlier that day, further supporting the conclusion that the teens were engaged in an escalating criminal act rather than a single error in judgment. Investigators reconstructed the route: the earlier break-in at the detached garage, the items stolen from the recreational room, the decision to return for the main home, and the shattering of the glass door that initiated the confrontation. They reviewed the clothing the teens wore, the weapons found on or near their bodies, and the statements from Rodriguez about what she and the teens intended to do. Every detail aligned with the legal conclusion. This was a planned home invasion, and the homeowner's response fell within self-defense laws. The entire case unfolded rapidly, but left a long trail of documentation: 911 recordings, police reports, autopsy confirmations, charging documents for the getaway driver, and the prosecutor's formal announcement clearing Peters of wrongdoing. No major element of the timeline remains in dispute. The only discrepancies in public reporting involve the exact spellings of the teens' names and their ages, which vary slightly across outlets. However, all credible sources agree that the intruders were teenagers wearing masks, carrying weapons, and actively inside the home at the time Peters opened fire. In the end, the Broken Arrow case became one of the most widely discussed home defense incidents in Oklahoma in more than a decade. It underscored the speed at which a burglary can escalate, the complications introduced by masked and armed intruders in a private residence, and the legal weight of a homeowner's right to defend themselves. For investigators and prosecutors, the evidence told a straightforward story. 3 teens involved in a planned burglary entered the wrong house at the wrong time, and the resident inside responded in a manner fully supported by state law. Number 5. Andrea Miller. Andrea Miller stepped into the garage doorway of an 80-year-old man's home in Long Beach, California, on the evening of July 22, 2014, alongside her burglary partner, Gus Richard Adams. She was 28 years old, dressed for a quick in-and-out break-in, and moving with confidence toward the back rooms of the house. Miller and Adams had targeted the home before. Police later confirmed this was not their first time entering Thomas Greer's residence. They knew he lived alone. They knew he kept cash in a safe. What they did not expect was that Greer would be there that night, and that the confrontation inside his home would end in a fatal shooting that drew national attention and a prosecutorial review. Greer told investigators that when he walked into his own hallway, he encountered both intruders already inside. The interaction turned violent almost immediately. According to police and later court filings, Greer was pushed or thrown to the floor, suffering injuries to his shoulder and collarbone. The 2 intruders moved past him, forcing open his safe and taking cash before attempting to leave through the same path they entered. Greer, who was significantly smaller and physically vulnerable due to his age, told detectives he believed the pair might return to harm him again. As they fled, he retrieved a .22 caliber revolver he kept inside the house. Miller and Adams ran into the rear alley behind Greer's property, heading toward the street. Greer followed behind them. The exact distance between them varies across reports, but all verified accounts agree on the core sequence. Miller was moving away from the house when Greer fired a single round. The shot struck her in the torso. She collapsed in the alley and died at the scene. Adams continued running and was arrested shortly afterward by Long Beach police officers responding to neighbors' calls. What happened next shaped the direction of the case. Greer told police and reporters that Miller had shouted she was pregnant. The Los Angeles County coroner later confirmed she was not. That detail became one of the most widely discussed elements of the case, not because it altered the medical findings, but because it added complexity to Greer's state of mind during the shooting. Detectives photographed the scene, documented the forced entry, the damaged safe, and the injuries on Greer's body. They questioned him immediately. Greer gave multiple statements, some measured, others blunt, as he described being assaulted in his own home by two much younger individuals. He said he was afraid, that he believed the pair had attacked him before, and that he feared they might return. His public comments in the days that followed drew attention, especially remarks taken by some outlets as vindictive, but the legal question rested on whether prosecutors could prove that Greer did not act out of fear as he described. Under California law, and specifically under the standard for homicide charges, the burden of proof required prosecutors to disprove self-defense beyond a reasonable doubt. The Los Angeles County District Attorney's Office reviewed the case evidence, including Greer's physical injuries, the sequence of the burglary, the location of the shooting, and the circumstances under which the intruders fled. After examining police reports and forensic findings, the DA's office announced it would not file murder or manslaughter charges against Greer. Prosecutors stated they could not meet the legal threshold to demonstrate he had acted with malice, or that he did not reasonably fear for his safety in the moments following the assault. They emphasized his age, his vulnerability, and the fact that he had been physically overpowered by two adults inside his own home. Although the shot was fired as the suspects fled, prosecutors concluded the overall scenario did not support a criminal filing. The case was formally closed with no charges against him. The criminal responsibility for Miller's death shifted instead to her accomplice. Under California's felony murder principles, when a death occurs during the commission of a dangerous felony, such as first-degree residential burglary or robbery, accomplices can be held legally accountable, even if they did not pull the trigger. Gus Richard Adams was charged with first-degree robbery and first-degree burglary. He later pleaded guilty to those charges and was sentenced to more than 10 years in state prison. Prosecutors stated that had they pursued full felony murder charges, he would have faced the possibility of a life term. Instead, the court accepted a plea agreement that focused on the burglary and robbery counts tied directly to the fatal incident. The autopsy report confirmed Miller died from a single gunshot wound. It also confirmed she was not pregnant, contradicting the claim Greer reported. Detectives found no weapon on either intruder. They did find evidence consistent with the assault inside the home and the forced entry into Greer's safe. Those details formed the backbone of the case file submitted to the district attorney. The forensic timeline, the injuries documented on the homeowner, and the suspect's decision to flee rather than surrender all aligned with the DA's conclusion that the state could not prove the shooting was unlawful. The Long Beach case appeared in national news cycles because it sat at the intersection of home defense, age disparity, and the blurred line between defensive action and the pursuit of fleeing suspects. For investigators, the facts were clear. Two individuals entered the home of an 80-year-old man, assaulted him, and took money from his safe. The homeowner retrieved a firearm and followed them into an alley, where he fired a single round that killed one of them. Prosecutors examined the evidence and the legal standards and determined the scenario did not support homicide charges. Adams, as the surviving intruder, was held accountable for the burglary and its fatal outcome. Today, the case is frequently cited in discussions about self-defense, proportional force, and the unique vulnerabilities of elderly homeowners confronted by younger, physically stronger intruders. The facts in this incident, the forced entry, the assault, the retreat, the pursuit, and the fatal shot, were documented in police reports, forensic findings, and the DA's official statements. Those verified records explain why Andrea Miller died in an alley behind a suburban home in Long Beach, and why prosecutors concluded that the 80-year-old man who pulled the trigger would not face criminal charges. Number 6. Antoine Parker. It was just before 6 o'clock on the evening of May 19, 2009, when 16-year-old Antoine Speedy Parker pushed through the front door of Reliable Discount Pharmacy in South Oklahoma City wearing a ski mask and moving quickly toward the counter. His 14-year-old partner, Javonte Ingram, followed behind him, holding a handgun supplied earlier that day by an adult accomplice. The two teenagers had come to the small neighborhood drugstore with a simple plan: threaten the staff, take the cash and narcotics, and escape to the stolen getaway car waiting outside with two adult organizers. What they did not expect was that the pharmacist behind the counter, 57-year-old Jerome J. Ersland, was already reaching for the handgun he kept at the ready for situations exactly like this one. As Parker advanced toward the counter, the two female employees in the store ran to the back room. Ursland drew his pistol and fired once. The bullet struck Parker in the head, and the teenager fell backward onto the pharmacy floor, unconscious. Ingram turned and ran out of the building, disappearing from the camera's view. Up to this moment, investigators and prosecutors later acknowledged the shooting could be understood as a defensive response to an armed robbery. The threat of aggression from the two masked teens was real, and the initial shot that stopped Parker was consistent with Oklahoma's strong statutory protections for homeowners, business owners, and employees confronted with violent felonies. What happened next was the center of the case. After firing the first shot, Ursland ran outside the pharmacy in pursuit of Ingram, but could not continue the chase due to chronic back problems. He returned inside less than a minute later. Surveillance footage captured every movement. Parker lay motionless on his back, not attempting to rise. Ursland stepped around the teenager's body, went behind the counter, placed his first gun down, opened a drawer, retrieved a second handgun, walked back to Parker, and fired 5 shots into his torso in rapid succession. According to the medical examiner, those abdominal wounds, not the initial head wound, were the injuries that caused Parker's death. Police and emergency responders arrived shortly afterward. The surveillance video, the ballistic evidence, and the autopsy findings formed the backbone of the investigation. Ursland gave interviews in the days that followed, including televised statements, during which he insisted that Parker was moving, talking, and still posed a threat. Prosecutors later argued those statements were contradicted by the video, which showed the teen lying flat and unresponsive. Detective reports and trial testimony confirmed that Parker was unarmed when Ursland fired the final 5 shots. The only gun inside the pharmacy, other than those belonging to Ursland, was the handgun Ingram carried when he fled. Oklahoma County District Attorney David Prater and his team drew a sharp distinction between the first shot and what followed. They stated publicly and repeatedly that the initial round was justified self-defense, but that the next 5 constituted an execution of a wounded and unconscious suspect. In 2011, after reviewing the physical evidence and witness testimony, a jury convicted Ursland of first-degree murder. The panel deliberated for only a few hours before returning the verdict. They recommended a sentence of life in prison with the possibility of parole. District Judge Ray Elliott imposed that sentence in July of the same year. The legal outcome extended beyond Ursland. Under Oklahoma's felony murder doctrine, adult accomplices Emmanuel E-Man Mitchell and Anthony Black Morrison, who planned the robbery and supplied the firearm to Ingram, were charged with first-degree murder for Parker's death. Morrison's conviction and life sentence were later upheld. Mitchell's conviction was reversed on procedural grounds, and the case was ordered for retrial. Ingram, as a 14-year-old juvenile, was adjudicated through the juvenile system with a different legal process. Ursland appealed his own conviction. The Oklahoma Court of Criminal Appeals affirmed the verdict in 2013, writing in its opinion that Ursland was not convicted for what he did initially, but for the final 5 shots fired at an unconscious, unarmed, and incapacitated teen. Subsequent federal habeas petitions raised claims about Ursland's memory of where the second gun was located, but federal judges rejected those arguments, citing the surveillance video and Ursland's shifting explanations. The case drew national attention because it intersected 2 powerful themes: the right to defend oneself during a violent felony, and the boundary at which defensive force becomes unlawful. Early public reaction cast Ursland as a veteran and pharmacist who fought off dangerous robbers. But once the full surveillance footage and medical findings were presented in court, prosecutors and jurors reached the same conclusion: that the moment Parker fell unconscious, the threat ended. And every shot that followed constituted excessive, unjustified, and ultimately lethal force under Oklahoma law. Today, Jerome Ursland remains incarcerated on a life sentence. Antoine Parker's death is cited frequently in legal discussions about the limits of self-defense, the role of video evidence in determining force, and how a single defensive act can turn into a criminal act when the threat has passed. The timeline, preserved on the pharmacy's cameras, the entry, the initial shot, the pursuit, the return, and the final volley, left a detailed and unambiguous record. and that record explains why a robbery that began with two masked teenagers in a neighborhood drugstore ended with a first-degree murder conviction for the pharmacist who survived it. Number 7. Diren Dede. It was late on the night of April 27, 2014, when 17-year-old Diren Dede stepped through the partially open garage door of a home in Missoula, Montana. He was a German exchange student from Hamburg, living with a host family for the school year, and like several other teenagers in the area, he had been garage hopping that evening, entering unlocked garages looking for alcohol. The opening in the garage door was deliberate, and there was a purse placed where it could be seen from the street. None of that was known to Dede as he walked in. Moments later, the homeowner, Marcus Karma, stepped out his front door with a loaded 12-gauge shotgun and moved toward the dark interior, where he believed a burglar had entered. In the 3 weeks leading up to that night, Karma's home had been burglarized at least once. Reports documented items taken from his garage, including marijuana and personal property. He told neighbors and acquaintances that he was angry about the repeated thefts and had begun staying up late waiting for the intruder to return. He and his partner, Janelle Flagger, installed motion sensors and a baby monitor aimed into the garage, and they left the door partially open on multiple occasions. Witness testimony later indicated Karma had talked in the days before the shooting about wanting to confront, or shoot, the person he believed was targeting his home. Those statements would become a key part of the case. Shortly before the shooting, motion sensors in the garage activated. The signal appeared on the monitor inside the house, alerting Karma and Flagger that someone was inside. Dede had stepped toward the interior of the garage, unaware of the surveillance setup. Karma took his shotgun and walked outside toward the open doorway. According to trial evidence and forensic reconstruction, he did not issue a verbal warning. He did not attempt to determine whether the person inside was armed. Instead, he stopped outside the threshold of the garage and fired 4 blasts blindly into the darkness. 3 shots were clustered low, moving laterally across the garage as if tracking a moving figure. The 4th shot was higher and struck Dede in the head. Another shot passed through his arm. He collapsed inside the garage. Paramedics arrived within minutes, but he was pronounced dead at the scene. He had no weapon. He carried no stolen items. He had been in the garage for only a short time when the shots were fired. The investigation quickly focused on the distinction between a homeowner reacting to a burglary and a homeowner preparing for one. Detectives examined the house, the surveillance setup, and the way the garage had been staged. Prosecutors from Missoula County concluded that Karma had not simply defended his home. They argued he had created a situation designed to attract an intruder and had waited for the opportunity to use lethal force. The presence of the baby monitor, the motion sensors, the purse placed in view, and the garage door left partly open formed the structure of their case. Witnesses, including a local hairdresser, told investigators that Karma had said he was staying up at night, waiting to shoot some kid. Defense attorneys argued that Karma feared another break-in and believed an intruder might be armed, pointing to the previous burglary where marijuana had been stolen. They emphasized that Montana law, including its Castle Doctrine protections, allows homeowners to use deadly force when confronted with an intruder in an occupied structure. Prosecutors responded that Karma had gone beyond protection and had crossed into deliberate, preemptive force. They said the law did not support firing without warning into a dark garage at a figure who had not threatened violence. In December 2014, after a multi-week trial, a Missoula County jury found Karma guilty of deliberate homicide. The evidence they cited most heavily included the surveillance setup, his pre-incident statements about waiting for burglars, and the forensic pattern of the shotgun blasts. The jury concluded that Dede's death was not the result of a spontaneous confrontation, but of a homeowner who had been preparing to use lethal force before any threat was presented. On February 12, 2015, District Judge Ed McLean sentenced Karma to 70 years in Montana State Prison, with no possibility of parole for at least 20 years. In court, the judge stated that Karma posed a danger to the community and that his actions were driven more by anger and retribution than by fear for the safety of his family. Dede's parents traveled from Germany to attend the proceedings. They told reporters afterward that the sentence brought some measure of justice, though it did not change the loss of their son. Karma appealed the conviction, arguing that extensive media coverage had prevented an impartial trial and that Montana's self-defense law had been misapplied. In February 2017, the The Montana Supreme Court unanimously upheld the conviction, writing that the evidence clearly supported the jury's finding that Karma had acted with intent. Later petitions to the United States Supreme Court were denied. A 2019 request for a new trial based on claims of ineffective assistance of counsel was rejected as well. Today, the case is cited extensively in discussions about self-defense, castle doctrine limits, and the difference between responding to a threat and anticipating one. The factual record, from the surveillance system to the staged garage to the pattern of the shots, formed a consistent narrative for investigators, prosecutors, and jurors. And that record explains why the death of 17-year-old Darren Dede inside a darkened Montana garage was legally defined as deliberate homicide rather than home defense. Number 8. Fred Barras. It was late on the night of August 20th, 1999, when 16-year-old Fred Barras moved through the downstairs rooms of a remote farmhouse called Bleak House in Emneth-Hungate, Norfolk. He and 29-year-old Brendan Fearon had broken in through a ground floor window, working their way inside the property. The house was isolated, surrounded by fields, and known by locals to have been targeted by burglars before. Upstairs in one of the rooms was the homeowner, 54-year-old farmer Anthony "Tony" Martin, who had spent years reporting thefts, losses, and damage on his property. At the moment Barras and Fearon entered the house, Martin was awake, armed with a pump-action Winchester Model 1300 shotgun he kept illegally, and positioned near the top of the stairs, overlooking the dimly lit interior below. Martin later told investigators he believed he was being invaded again, and that he feared for his life because he had been victimized repeatedly and lived alone. The documented record shows that he had lost his legal shotgun certificate years earlier after firing at a man's vehicle in 1994, but the shotgun remained in his possession. Forensic evidence and witness accounts reconstructed what happened next. From the upstairs landing, Martin fired down the staircase and into the adjoining room where the intruders were moving. The shotgun was loaded with birdshot. 3 rounds were discharged in total. One blast came from the staircase area. 2 more were fired as the intruders turned and tried to escape through the downstairs window they had entered. Barras was struck from behind. Shot pellets entered his back and legs. Fearon, hit in the leg, managed to force himself out of the window and flee into the night. Barras followed but collapsed outside near the property. Fearon was located later by police and taken for medical treatment. Barras was pronounced dead at the scene. Neither intruder was armed with a firearm. They had broken into the house to steal valuables, as they had done in other burglaries in the region. Police and paramedics arrived on the property, documenting the trajectory of the shotgun blasts and the location of Barras's body outside the house. Investigators recovered the illegal firearm and established the firing positions on the landing and stairwell. The Crown Prosecution Service charged Martin within months, focusing on the central legal question under English law, whether the force used was reasonable for self-defense. The prosecution argued that Martin had shot at burglars who were fleeing the property, firing from an elevated, protected position in darkness, and that Barras was hit in the back at a point when he no longer posed an immediate threat. At trial in April 2000, the jury heard forensic testimony describing the downward angle of the shots and the positions of Barras and Fearon as they attempted to flee. The prosecution emphasized that English law permitted only reasonable force and that shooting a retreating intruder with an illegally held shotgun exceeded that threshold. The defense argued that Martin, living alone in an isolated property repeatedly targeted by criminals, believed he was at imminent risk of harm and reacted in fear. They presented evidence of previous break-ins and Martin's long-standing sense of vulnerability. The jury deliberated and returned a verdict of guilty for the murder of Fred Barras and wounding with intent toward Brendan Fearon. He received a life sentence for murder, plus concurrent sentences for the wounding and firearms charges. Martin's legal team appealed, introducing psychiatric evaluations that had not been available at trial. The reports diagnosed Martin with paranoid personality disorder and later Asperger's syndrome, conditions the Court of Appeal accepted as substantially impairing his judgment that night. In October 2001, the court replaced the murder conviction with one of manslaughter on the grounds of diminished responsibility. His sentence was reduced to 5 years for manslaughter, with a concurrent 3-year term for the wounding. He served approximately 3 years before his release on license in July 2003. The case ignited a national debate across the United Kingdom. Some viewed Martin as a man abandoned by authorities and repeatedly targeted by burglars who finally fought back. Others saw the case as a clear violation of the principles governing self-defense, that a homeowner cannot lawfully use lethal force against someone who is running away. The photographs taken that night, the forensic trajectories, the illegal firearm, and the documented diagnosis presented on appeal formed the core factual framework for the courts. And that record explains why the death of 16-year-old Fred Barris at Bleak House became one of the most widely discussed home defense cases in modern British legal history. Number 9. Ricky Slater. It was just after 3:20 in the morning on March 26, 2016, when 40-year-old Ricky Slater moved through the hallway of a home in the Newcastle suburb of Hamilton. He was carrying a shoulder bag containing 3 knives, cannabis, and methamphetamine. According to the later reconstruction, he stepped into or near the bedroom of a sleeping baby girl, though the child's mother and the baby were not home that night. The homeowner, 33-year-old chef Benjamin Batterham, had been awake in another room when he heard movement inside the house. The encounter that followed began inside the home, but moved rapidly toward the street outside, where the fatal struggle took place. Batterham confronted Slater almost immediately. At that moment, Slater fled from the house and ran into the driveway area in front of the property. Batterham chased him. Witness statements and forensic evidence documented that Batterham tackled Slater to the ground and restrained him around the neck. A neighbor who opened his door that night reported seeing Batterham holding Slater in a chokehold while delivering multiple punches. Several neighbors told investigators that they repeatedly urged Batterham to stop, but the struggle continued until Slater became unresponsive. Police and paramedics were called and arrived within minutes. Slater suffered multiple cardiac arrests in hospital and died the following day. The circumstances leading up to the confrontation became central to the legal analysis. The investigation confirmed that Slater had broken into the home armed with knives and under the influence of methamphetamine. His toxicology report later showed high levels of the drug in his system, and medical findings established that he had underlying heart disease. According to the medical specialists who testified, these conditions made him at elevated risk of sudden cardiac arrest when exposed to stress or exertion. That detail would later complicate the question of whether the chokehold itself caused the fatal outcome. Police charged Batterham with murder, and the case moved toward committal hearings, then trial. Prosecutors argued that Batterham used excessive force, continuing to assault Slater at a point when he was already restrained and no longer able to flee. They emphasized witness statements, describing a prolonged chokehold and repeated punches, as well as reports that Batterham shouted threats during the altercation. Their position was that Batterham's actions exceeded what the law allowed in the defense of a dwelling or during a citizen's arrest. The defense maintained that Batterham had discovered an armed intruder inside his home, specifically near the bedroom of his infant daughter, and that Slater's possession of knives and his presence inside the house at that hour gave Batterham every reason to believe he and his family were in danger. They argued that Batterham pursued and restrained Slater for the purpose of detaining him until police arrived. Medical experts called by the defense testified that Slater's death was most likely caused by a combination of methamphetamine intoxication, an existing heart condition, and the physical exertion of the struggle rather than by asphyxiation alone. During the trial, the court heard detailed forensic testimony. One specialist told the jury that the chokehold may have contributed to Slater's collapse, but was unlikely to be the sole cause of death. Another explained that the fatal sequence of cardiac arrests was consistent with stimulant toxicity and coronary disease under conditions of sudden, intense stress. These findings aligned with the defense argument that Batterham's actions could not be categorically identified as the direct cause of death from a medical standpoint. After 2 weeks of proceedings, the jury reviewed the evidence, the items found in Slater's bag, the toxicology report, the heart condition, the neighbor's statements, the chokehold, and the location of the struggle outside the home. They returned a verdict of not guilty on all charges, both murder and manslaughter. The court accepted that Batterham had acted in self-defense and within the scope of a lawful citizen's arrest, given that Slater was armed and had entered the home unlawfully. In the months following the verdict, a judge examined the prosecution's decision to pursue homicide charges and concluded that the decision had been unreasonable. The medical evidence, the judge noted, offered no clear basis to support the allegation that Batterham's actions alone caused Slater's death. Batterham was granted the right to seek recovery of substantial legal costs. The case raised considerable public debate throughout Australia. Some saw Batterham as a homeowner protecting his family from a dangerous intruder. Others argued the case highlighted how easily physical restraint can escalate into fatal violence when emotions run high and a suspect is already subdued. But the evidentiary record, Slater's break-in, the presence of knives, the toxicology findings, the heart condition, the witness observations, and the medical uncertainty over the precise cause of death became the basis for both the jury's conclusion and the later judicial ruling. And that record explains why the fatal confrontation between Benjamin Batterham and Ricky Slater on a Newcastle street was ultimately judged as self-defense rather than unlawful homicide. Number 10. Keandre Funches. It was about 2:30 in the morning on August 3rd, 2017, when 27-year-old Keandre Funches entered a small home on Griggs Street in Marietta, Georgia. According to police, he was led inside by another man, identified later as Javarian Mitchell, who had access to the property. Green, who lived there with her 3 children, was awake when she heard movement in the hallway. When she stepped out of her bedroom, she saw Funches inside the house. Investigators later reported that he had threatened her with a handgun, and she told officers that she believed he intended to harm her and her children. The confrontation escalated in seconds. Green retrieved the handgun she kept in the home. The accounts reviewed by police showed that she fired at Funches during the encounter inside the property. Officers who responded to the scene found Funches unresponsive and later confirmed that he had died inside the home. Green and her husband were detained for questioning as detectives began documenting the sequence of events, gathering witness statements, and collecting the firearm evidence. Her 3 children were placed temporarily with relatives while the investigation continued. Police focused immediately on Mitchell, the man they identified as having given Funches access to the home. He was arrested the same day and charged with multiple felonies, including aggravated assault with a firearm, false imprisonment, cruelty to children in the 3rd degree, and counts connected to felony murder statutes for facilitating the invasion. Detectives recovered items from the scene and conducted interviews that placed Mitchell at the center of the entry and escalation. The working theory from investigators was that Mitchell knowingly allowed an armed individual to enter an occupied residence where children were present. As the investigation progressed, prosecutors reviewed the physical evidence, the 911 call, and the statements from Green describing the moment Funches threatened her. They examined the presence of the handgun, the position of the body, and the accounts from neighbors who heard the disturbance. Toxicology later indicated that Funches had methamphetamine in his system, and medical findings suggested he may have had underlying health issues, although details on those conditions were not fully disclosed. These factors became relevant in evaluating the question of causation and whether the homeowner's actions alone could be considered criminal. Despite this, the district attorney initially pursued homicide charges. That decision brought the case into the court system for a full trial. Green's defense emphasized that she was a mother confronted by an intruder in the early morning hours, who believed the man was armed and threatening her children. They framed her actions as a direct response to an immediate threat in her own home. Prosecutors countered that the use of deadly force required justification and that the circumstances needed to be examined carefully. During trial proceedings, evidence was presented about the items found in Funches's possession, the condition of the home, and the statements Green made to responding officers. Testimony also highlighted the role of Mitchell, whose actions in bringing Funches into the home became central to the prosecution's narrative of joint responsibility. Expert medical testimony indicated that Funches's methamphetamine use and physical condition could not be separated from the cause of death, complicating efforts to attribute the fatal outcome solely to the shooting. After hearing the evidence, the jury returned a verdict of not guilty on all homicide charges. They accepted that Green had acted in defense of herself and her children during a sudden and potentially lethal intrusion. The court's conclusion also reflected the medical uncertainty surrounding the exact cause of death and the role that Funches's own drug use and health might have played. In the aftermath, a judge reviewed the prosecution's case and ruled that the decision to pursue charges had been unreasonable, writing that the evidence did not support a definitive criminal theory. That ruling allowed Green to seek recovery of her legal costs. The case generated strong reaction within the community, where some residents argued that homeowners should not be prosecuted for defending their children during a violent home invasion. Others emphasized the importance of examining use of force carefully, even in highly charged situations. But the documented record, the 911 call, the handgun, the presence of an accomplice who enabled the break-in, the toxicology findings, and the jury's acceptance of self-defense forms the basis for the legal outcome. And that record explains why the shooting of 27-year-old Keandre Funches inside a Marietta home was ruled justified rather than criminal. These cases show how quickly a home invasion can escalate and how heavily the law examines every decision made in those few seconds. Some homeowners were cleared because the threat was immediate and documented. Others were convicted because the force they used went beyond what the law defines as self-defense. Across countries and court systems, the lesson is consistent. The moment the threat ends is the moment the law expects the force to end as well. If you want more verified, fact-driven true crime investigations like this, subscribe and turn on notifications. It helps the channel bring you deeper, more accurate cases every week. Stay safe until next time.